and heal those in time of loss. But we also know that the status quo was already a crisis for many people as a result of economic inequality in our country, as well as especially in our higher education system. We want to take the opportunity to step back and re-envision how we can create a more equitable version of higher education for the future. Today, I'm joined by several great folks to discuss this topic. In a few minutes, I'll be speaking with Dr. Bridget Burns, Executive Director of the University Innovation Alliance. After that, I'll be speaking with Dr. Antonio Duran of Auburn University, Dr. Jayakumar of the University of California, Riverside, as well as Jessica Mulligan, Senior Legislative Assistant for Representative Jayapal from Washington State. But first, I want to let you all know that you're invited to submit questions using the Q&A function on your platform, which you'll see on your screen. You'll also have the opportunity to respond to several poll questions throughout. I have the honor of serving as the Policy and Advocacy Director for Higher Education and the Workforce here at YI. And one of the things that I'm most proud about our organization is that we foreground the stories of our students and our young advocates across the country. To reflect that principle, I want to now turn it over to our young advocate, Katalina Garcia, a student at the Community College of Denver. Katalina, take it away.
Hi, everyone. My name is Katalina Garcia, and I'm from Denver, Colorado. I'm actually outside right now. It's really nice out. I want to take advantage of that. But my story is non-traditional. I'm a very non-traditional student. After high school, I went straight into the workforce. And I think it was a couple years I decided to go to community college. But I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I was going to study criminal justice, but I dropped out. And then after a couple more years, I went back to school. I went to technical college to Emily Griffith. And there I got my certificate. I was actually going full time, but I've always had to work when going to school just because I have to be able to maintain myself. I don't have parent support for school, so I have to support myself in that. And I did get emancipated early on because I didn't have my mom or dad to help me with school. And so that has been interesting. I'm also a first generation student. And like I said, I didn't have guidance from my family. My parents didn't go to college, so I had to figure out how I was going to go to college and what I wanted to study and just figure out the system on my own. And it was not until I got mentors that I actually went back to college. I'm actually in college now at community college. Having mentors is really helpful because I can talk to someone that has actually been to college or is in the field of studies that I'm interested in. Um, Young Invincibles actually helped me get a mentor in the political field, which has been very helpful. And currently, I'm still working, and I'm on my way. I'm like 65% done with my degree as of now. So I'm done, and it has been interesting with the online transition for COVID just because I had connectivity issues, and so that was hard. I actually ended up using my hotspot to do my homework and get my assignments in, but at some towards the end of the month it was down, and it was hard to. It was stressful to see how I was gonna turn in those assignments. But once I got my connectivity figured out, it was a big weight lifted off my shoulders. but I'm also a in-person hands-on learner, and the online transition has been hard. It's been really hard, but I just finished my semester as of Monday actually, and I passed with A's. So I was able to adjust to the online learning, but I just want to keep in mind that
Well, thanks, Catalina, for sharing your story and for helping to frame this conversation going forward. And I look forward to coming back during our Q&A portion.
it really changed, and so I think it would help more students attend university, and I think that advocating on all types of forms of higher education would be beneficial, just because I know when I was in high school, 4-year university and military was the only thing that was really. Oh, I don't know what happened. My internet is really weird. Still hear me? I'm talking.
I think we're having some connectivity issues
Yeah.
with you, but we'll come back in a little bit.
Kyle?
Yes.
I feel like this drives home like the most important point, which is, we have students who are privileged, and we've been wrestling with equity issues across the education continuum for a long time, but this is a new layer. This is an invisible access to broadband, access to internet is now affecting learning. It's affecting disproportionately low-income first generation and communities of color, and it's affecting rural communities. And if we don't figure out this issue, then all of the policy decisions that we make around education are going to be less, they don't matter as much, right? So it's I would say COVID, this is a very relevant point, which is it's kind of this additional layer of challenge for us that we really all have to get together and work on, or else it's going to affect the next generation of students in a significant way.
Yeah, that's a great point, Bridget. And let's maybe we'll go one step further. Kind of building on that. Given this moment and what we're seeing and learning, what do you see as kind of the must-have moments for higher ed to move forward from where we are right now?
Me? Well, I mean, so for me right now, what we're trying to do is focus on listening to students and making sure you have consistent channels to understand what is happening to them and how they're experiencing this moment in real time. We cannot have delayed empathy channels. We have to be able to have insights because it's showing up. COVID is showing up in your life differently than it's showing up in mine. It's showing up day by day in different ways. And we have to be in tune with how their education is being affected, how the interplay of families, being laid off, actual, health issue, like there's just so many things, right? So I would just say broadly, institutions have to position themselves to be in a real-time feedback mode to know what is happening to their students. And they have to focus on the most vulnerable populations, which is now shifting, right? Students who weren't low income are now low income, right? Because a lot of families have been financially eviscerated and will be. And so I think The work of the Alliance is really about redesigning institutions around the needs of low-income first generation and students of color, because we know that if it serves them, it will actually serve everyone. Because everyone needs good communication and classes that are well designed, and they need to have their financial aid information understandable. They need to have the process easy and simple and clean. All of the things that we would do for vulnerable students, we think would help every student. So I would say right now, you got to listen. You cannot go it alone. I mean, if institutions siloed and head down and thinking they're going to invent the wheel, that's insane. We have to band together right now, because no one institution will be able to solve the challenges that are coming up. And if you have strong communication with other campuses, they might be 3 months ahead of you on something, or 1 week ahead of you on something. And that's what my campus is. Like, one campus was ready to close before others were. Some were sending employees home faster than others. And so you just have to make sure you're not going it alone. I think work together, strong sense of empathy, but then get back to the right work, which is, it's always been about redesigning and reorienting our work to serve students, especially the most vulnerable. And that means that that's got to change even more now.
Yeah, and am I right that you all started in about 2014, putting together some of the largest kind of flagship institutions in the country toward these goals? Could you tell us a little bit about kind of the driving force of the Alliance and your focus on increasing those graduation rates? How much of it is drawing from kind of the research and best practices and kind of pushing those out to those institutions versus this work at Purdue? How can we apply it to the University of Kansas? How can we go somewhere else and apply those lessons? How much of it is kind of top down versus organic and learning from experience?
So first we started because the presidents and chancellors, most of them who formed the Alliance, were former first generation low income and students of color. They grew up, turned into college presidents, and actually wanted to try and change things for the next generation. And so our work is to really help universities understand where they have the same problems, and therefore we should all put our heads together to come up with a solution that works to solve these problems, right? Most of higher ed is designed to convince you that your problems are special and different and just yours. And yet every institution, they're all kind of like slightly different size, color, and shape, but they're basically the same problems. And change is hard. And so you're going to do best to band together. So what we do is we help them see where there's the same challenges, and it's typically around serving the students who we care our highest priority, which are low-income first-gen and students of color. And we find practices that work at one institution, and then we help unpack that idea. So like one example, predictive analytics. Most people heard about that first at Arizona State or Georgia State. So what we do is like lean in, understand exactly what they did to implement that and what it really looks like, and across different types of campuses, and then basically try and help other campuses learn about that intervention, figure out how to apply it, and do it in a cohort so they're not doing it alone. And the idea is that by working together on an idea that's already been proven and having a trusted circle of colleagues, that you go faster, it costs less, and that you can be able to deliver more. And so we've done that multiple times, where we basically find an intervention that has been proven to work, and we try and scale it very rapidly across our campuses. And in the process, we think that we learn how other campuses could do it even faster. And so that's our goal. Is we're kind of like an experiment, a public experiment. And every time we scale, we're helping the rest of the country be able to scale faster. So then we're broadcasting all the time about, hey, don't do this, do this. Here, learn from our mistakes, essentially. So yeah, that's kind of what we've been about, is accelerating innovation to serve the most vulnerable students.
Yeah, thanks for that context. And I'll ask you one more question before I turn to Uma. I was interested in a piece that Kevin Carey from New America wrote in the New York Times a few days ago, really, I think, expressing a concern that in the future, public universities as we know them will be, I think he said, public in name only. And we learned from the Great Recession about state disinvestment in higher education and the waterfall effect on college affordability and the debt crisis. And in a world where public institutions are sort of in the free market to compete for students in the kind of same price points as others, do you have the same kind of concern about the implication for that potential prospect going forward for the way those institutions relate with their students and how they think about them as a student versus a customer?
You know, I don't worry about that as much with my campuses because they've had such, I mean, I have campuses with such historical disinvestment that they're more state located. And yet you can't look at their work and not see that they are obviously compelled by the land grant mission or by their, you know, their founding principles despite that. But I don't think that that means that states should back off in their responsibility, because I can't vouch for, you know, not every institution has made those choices. What Kevin talked about in terms of the uptick in reliance on international students and out-of-state students, totally true. What's going to happen now when you can't actually bring those students in because they're going to stay closer to home? I think, you know, at the end of the day, we have to understand that this is, you know, we think about this in terms of right now what the issue is, but this is really in the future. This is about the long-term economic competitiveness of our country. And this is about the equity of our country. This is about making sure that no matter what family you're born into, that you have the same ability to, the same opportunity to achieve your life's purpose. And you want institutions, you want public institutions to stay committed to that, to ensuring that. The problem is, it's not just like a calculation of like, you know, which students do I want to serve and who do I want to neglect? The truth is, these are very complex institutions. It's very difficult. There's not a single easy choice right now for our college president. They are just, I mean, like layoffs and reductions, and that's going to be a good day, you know? So I would just say, yes, I mean, I definitely am concerned about those same things, but my lens is really, I have tremendous empathy for the challenge of being a university president right now. I wish people understood just how critical these critical research universities are to the future of our country. I mean, you can't, like right now, we obviously care quite a bit more about science these days and understand the impact of having really strong research and making sure that they're able to invest in all citizens. And so giving them that flexibility and not forcing them into these terrible choices. So yeah, I mean, I think he flags really important concerns, but again, like you look at Arizona State that's had cut after cut after cut, Georgia State cut after cut after cut, and yet still making decisions based on what is the best for their state, their community, and the country and the world. And so I think the core values of higher education are still good. And I just think that the more that the financial situation gets worse and worse, and we force them into making terrible choices, there are no good choices. And it's our job to make sure that we're protecting the most vulnerable so that we can preserve the future of our democracy, which is really what higher education is about.
Yeah, that's a great point, and maybe a good time to pivot to Uma. And you're at one of those large public universities, and a lot of your research, I know, has really looked at the experiences of those historically marginalized populations, particularly on predominantly white campuses. And as we think about this pandemic and its disproportionate effects on communities of color, I'm wondering how you're thinking about the lessons you've learned from your research and how they apply to this current moment as we think about next steps for higher ed as a field and how to better support those students going forward. I think you're still muted.
Yes, sorry about that. I was just saying thank you for having me today. I wanted to share just like 3 snapshots of my research. Obviously, these are done in thinking about universities in person, and so it's interesting to think about how these then apply to the online environment, but I think they do in very real ways. And so the reason I decided to still kind of share my first 2 points, the third one is related to COVID, but the first 2 points is that I think there's a danger in forgetting about these very core issues that have been perpetual, and just as we think about online environments, they don't occur in a vacuum, although it seems that way. And I don't think they're all created equal. And so institutional context still matters, even though visually one classroom that's a Harvard classroom looks the same as a Cal State Northridge classroom in terms of if you just look at the online space, but they are still carrying that institutional history and legacy and climate. And so I kind of want to make that as one of the key points that institutions need to continue thinking about. So the first point I wanted to make from my research is the importance of critical mass to reduce the harms of racial isolation, tokenism, and stereotype threat. And so my colleague Kenneth Garcia and I propose a new term, dynamic diversity, to promote a contextual understanding of critical mass that goes beyond considering numbers to include the campus climate, legacies of discrimination, cross-racial dynamics, and classroom conditions for meaningful participation. And I think those issues of what is necessary for meaningful participation and creating a positive and healthy campus or learning climate is extremely important as we think about online spaces. So institutions must, while they're dealing with all of this, like very complex issues, it's important to not forget about historical legacies and organizational signals that shape the campus climate, which include how are the responses in touch with the needs of the most vulnerable students. That signals to them what the campus climate is. And so I think that while we're in this moment of organizational crisis, it really is an opportunity for institutions to communicate to their most vulnerable students and students of color in particular, how much they do care about them and how much they care about being inclusive, how much they care about investing in exclusionary frameworks that that are still lingering. So that was one point I wanted to make. And during this moment of crisis where we're having to many changes are happening that we would have talked about as being impossible. For example, for students with disabilities that could benefit from online services were told for many years that that wasn't a possibility, and yet we've seen institutions rapidly go online. So just seeing the level of institutional change that can happen is inspiring, and I think we have to think about what does that mean and how can we kind of leverage those changes to support our most vulnerable students. And one example that I'm very interested in is thinking about admissions practices. I've been on admissions committees, I've done research on admissions, I'm an expert witness in an affirmative action court case on admissions. So something that I care a lot about, and thinking about how, just on my experience on in admissions work, is there's such resistance to reducing the impact of SAT, even though it's known for its racial bias and its income level bias. And yet now institutions are going to have to do that. So how can we this is a moment where we are forced to be able to create institutional admissions selection processes that have the capacity to be much more inclusive. So that, I think, is an interesting possibility that I see. The other thing is addressing the new challenges of a Trump-informed era of white fragility and innocence, including white supremacist rhetoric in the guise of calls for free speech. I think that's an issue that we have to think about as we go online. One thing that I've noticed in my work on whiteness and white student defense strategies is that there is a process of leaving, and for example, that happens that students of color don't have the luxury to opt out, and that's even more possible when you're in an online environment, to have a level of anonymity that then can exacerbate issues of race, and specifically embolden white students to be more hostile because they have the anonymity to do so. That's what I've seen in my research on looking at white students in the HBCU context, and how their white fragility kind of operates and manifests in much more complicated ways than when looking at predominantly white environments. And the third point that I wanted to make that draws from my most recent research that is working alongside, it's a collaboration with my student, Kenyon Whitman, who is the driver of these research questions. And so I just want to acknowledge that his role in this. But we're looking at research on foster and system-impacted college-going youth. Foster and system-impacted youth are already often overlooked, and the COVID-19 pandemic has only magnified the challenges that this vulnerable population navigates on a daily basis. And our preliminary data finds that there are 7 interwoven challenges, including policy, basic needs, transitions, healthcare, and staffing. And so I wanted to highlight just 3 of these themes, and I'm happy to talk about others, but I just understand that there's a lot to, and I don't want to take up too much space. But in terms of the policy challenge, thinking about government entitlement programs such as AB 12 that extends foster youth status to age 21, supporting college going, and the Shafee grant, which is a $5,000 Cal grant for college going foster youth who are eligible through age 26. They're integral to meeting the basic needs of foster youth. And as research shows that paying for housing and food are their primary concerns. So foster youth are particularly vulnerable to homelessness because they lack family privilege and thus no safety net. So these, so if they have to drop out or stop out of college because of COVID related issues, they also lose access to these entitlement programs, and that's something that needs to be considered. In terms of basic needs, 60% of foster youth experience food insecurity, the highest amount of all subgroups. And there's a report, the Basic Needs report by the University of California that shows that 13% of foster youth experience homelessness, and this was 2.6 times the rate of other students. And so just thinking about how this is going to continue to impact them as schools shut down, and how the displacement of foster youth in housing exacerbates other resource-related issues and their current anxieties that impact their, like, how they experience the campus. And then the other thing that I wanted to highlight, which I've seen from my research, but also, did I not place that? Oh, I don't have it written here, but the staffing challenge, I forgot to grab that from the research, but I wanted to point out that there are many times that institutions do get funding. For example, previously when UC Riverside in particular, because of their level of diversity, was given some grant funding for LCFF schools, which are low income schools that have a high number of foster youth and system impacted youth. And the Guardian Scholars Program, which my student Kenyon Whitman runs at UCR, which is staffed with one person, which is the norm, and that's so upsetting. So unlike other offices that do student services that have much more expansive staffs, oftentimes Guardian Scholars and foster youth programming have literally one staff person that has to do everything. And so I remember seeing that there was this $1.2 million coming to the university and being really excited, and then going and asking him like, oh, like, what does that mean for, what are you all doing with that money? And he did not see any of it. His program did not see a cent of that. So, and then that's staff that we interviewed talked about just like, what is the money and support coming in, and are they going to see that? And given that they've already been vulnerable, they already have to depend on funding from external sources. So all of their funding most of their funding comes from external grants. So that creates some level of stability, because they're not having to depend on the institution, but it also highlights the lack of commitment of the institution. And so just wanted to highlight the importance of like really asking these questions of, where is the money that is coming and going, and how can we ensure that it actually reaches programs such as Guardian Scholars and foster youth and system impacted youth programming? Like, how are they seeing that money and support that? The little support that is coming in, how are they seeing that support?
Yeah.
So I'm there.
Thanks, Emma, for all that. It's really helpful context for this whole conversation, understanding kind of the moment and how higher ed fits in, not only is reflecting society, but how society in many ways reflects the inequities we see in higher ed as well. And Tony, I want to turn to you, because I think I know you're also on the front lines of this, and a lot of your work is we're thinking about the student experience, student identity, but you're also finishing your first year as a teacher in higher ed. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your reflection and having to make that mid-year pivot and how you're seeing your research perspective coming into your teaching and how your students are doing.
Yeah, thank you, Kyle. So a lot of my research focuses on student experiences, student identity, and student success in higher ed, specifically for minoritized individuals. And what I think this time has shown me, and I think hopefully is showing others, is that the challenges that we're seeing students facing at this time have always been there, right? It's just that this time is bringing them to the surface and hopefully getting people's attention in order to really think about how we transform systems based on the challenges that students might face. And similarly, I think it also shows how students have long practiced resilience in the face of oppressive structures and how they're continuing to do so during this time. So for example, right, a lot of my work by focusing on identity focuses on how colleges are not containers, right? Our students have always existed outside of our campuses. I mean, sometimes I think that's hard for people to understand. But what that means is that our students have constantly faced challenges in terms of those who work, those who have caregiving responsibilities, those who may or may not have access to basic needs, and those who might really benefit from communities on and off campus. And these are challenges that have been documented for a great period of time in our research, but now they're being brought to the forefront. So for example, so my work focuses on queer and trans students, students of color, and what we know for many of these students coming to campus is an opportunity for them to live out their identities that they may not be able to do at communities back home. And so we're facing the question of how is it that we support individuals who may have relied on campus as a way to explore who they are and who may no longer have that physical connection. At the same time, we know that the ways that people have been resilient are now ways that we can learn from them. So for example, with queer and trans students, when in the absence of physical community, they have long turned to virtual communities to find people who are like them. And so now I'm advocating that we learn from our students in the ways that they have been oftentimes forced to do this work, but really we need to center their perspectives in thinking about how we can create equitable systems at this time. So those are some of the things that I'm thinking about that this time has really showed me as a faculty member.
Yeah, and so let's take a different look at that, because I'm someone who thinks that we are going to always struggle to have equity for our students if we don't have equity for our faculty and staff as well. And so I'm interested in your kind of reflection as a new faculty member on how you're seeing the dynamics of higher ed, equity for faculty and how that's reflected in how we think about student affairs issues as well.
Yeah, for sure. So I think also really always bubbling below the surface has been that academia has always privileged certain types of faculty, right? And that there have long been issues of inequity as it relates to different faculty types, and also as it relates to social identities. And so at this time, I'm definitely feeling and hoping that we can reimagine structures for those who are adjunct faculty, right, who are non-tenured track, because largely these are the people who are being affected in this moment. I'm thinking about certain disciplines, right, that might be explicitly hurt. So for example, the humanities or those that disciplines that take a social and cultural analysis lens, because I think when we're making these financial decisions, oftentimes it's probably going to be those departments that are going to be hurt more. And so I think we need to think across, like, how are we privileging certain faculty ranks at this time, how are we privileging certain disciplines, and then also, right, minoritized faculty have long had the issues of having to engage in invisible labor to support students, and so I'd imagine that that's being augmented during this time of supporting those students who hold minoritized identities.
What do you mean by invisible labor? Unpack that a little bit for everybody.
Great question. So oftentimes those who hold minoritized identities, right, as students might gravitate towards those who look like them, right? Oftentimes we put our trust in those who identify similarly to us. And what that ends up happening, what ends up happening as a result of that is that faculty with minoritized identities might do increased amount of labor in terms of supporting students that those with privileged identities may not. Right. And so it's those conversations that faculty are having with students about how to navigate the academy, about what experiences they're having as minoritized individuals on campus that turns into this invisible labor. So not only are you teaching, not only are you doing your research, but you're supporting these students on top of that, which is important work, but it doesn't oftentimes translate into the ways that we are evaluated or compensated in our faculty work. And so that's why it's referred to as invisible labor. And so during this time, I think that as we're reimagining what, like, for example, promotion strategies look like as a result of COVID-19, we also need to be accounting for this invisible labor, who can remain productive during this time. These are all important questions we need to be thinking about.
Yeah,
I'm in on that same note, because as a faculty member experiencing this as well, and I'll keep it really short, that I love how you framed it, Antonio, and I agree with everything that you said. And I also want to add that in addition to, as someone who's now at the associate professor rank and has endured so much of that invisible labor, as I'm sure that I can just tell that people probably gravitate to you, Antonio, but not necessarily because of the social identity and the way you look, but also because of your perspectives, your ideological stance, and level of empathy and understanding. So I just want to not let white colleagues off the hook as much, and say that part of it is because, and given my research on colorblind frames, a lot of it is also the level of white fragility amongst white faculty, the levels of colorblind frames and microaggressions that students of color experience at the hands of white faculty. And so I have many like white allies, and whatever term anyone wants to use, I'll just use allies for right now, but people that I consider allies that are ideologically matched, that do a great job of supporting students of color and other, marginalized and vulnerable students. So I don't think that it's only, it's true that, there is initial connection. There's a door that's open by the way that I look. Hello, what is that? I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Sorry about that. I'm so sorry about that.
We're all managing all the platforms.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for bringing that perspective, Uma. And I want to remind folks to make use of the Q&A box as questions come to mind. And we just had a poll go up for our viewers asking from a set of options where they see the best support for students long-term. And our top two responses were, one, improving support for basic needs like housing and food security, which shouldn't be a surprise, particularly given the course of this conversation. But the most common answer was on expanding federal funding to cover a larger share of the costs of higher education, particularly in this moment when we know that many states will have their budgets under severe crunch. And I know, I think in California, something like a 30% revenue reduction is facing the state. So Jessica, maybe this is a good time to turn back here to DC, and from a policy perspective at the federal level, I know it's been a really active week here, to say the least. But thinking about the lessons from the Great Recession and thinking about the current moment, what are you hearing and what are you seeing as some of the most important things we can do to shore up the system for today's students and for students going forward?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I think that there is a recognition, at least among many lawmakers, that the scale of relief that we've delivered is just completely inadequate. Even the bill that we have that will be on the House floor likely tomorrow, it does a much better job. It provides about $37 billion, mostly focused toward public universities that will be impacted by the state budget cuts. But even that won't meet the need, and doesn't really meet the asks, and there's going to need to be more. We just heard from public institutions in our state, Washington State, that they have to plan for a 15% budget shortfall for the next fiscal year. And you know what that means? That means faculty staff layoffs, potentially increases in cost of attendance for students, less student support services that help them, get through. And I think we're especially concerned about the community colleges as well. We saw the California state community colleges sued the administration for imposing restrictions on aid to undocumented students. It's incredible that, or not incredible, but half of the students are undocumented at California's community colleges. And so they have all this federal money that they can't use. So, the bill that we'll be voting on tomorrow does prevent the Department of Education from doing that again, but it's going to be a big challenge to get it to the finish line. We have a Senate that doesn't really feel the need to act anymore right now, but we're really hoping that this bill will put the pressure on and just remind folks the need. One other thing I wanted to call out is to protect students from closing institutions. So whether that's for-profits or nonprofits, we really need to make sure that we're protecting students. And we could see some closures with a forthcoming recession, and that's just another thing that we need to look at. And then finally, I think and this goes back to what Katalina was experiencing at the beginning. We really don't know what the equity implications are of the transition to online learning. Dr. Fauci told Congress earlier this week that that students re-entering in the fall might be a bridge too far. So we may be in this for quite a while, and we don't have any tools to track what that means for equity and for folks who don't typically, have good internet service and can't just seamlessly transition to online learning. So there's definitely an effort, I think, among some policymakers to try to at least set up structure so that we can track any gaps in equity and try to address them as they come up, because that's one last thing that's very critical.
Yeah, thanks. And we had a question come in that is one of the more pressing ones right now, and a priority for YI in these conversations has been to advance the conversation around some level of student debt forgiveness and student debt cancellation. And so I'd love to pose the question first to you, and then maybe bring Bridget back and any perspective Katalina might have on student debt relief and the equity implications. There's a conversation about, disproportionately, a lot of that debt is on graduate school loans, and is that the most equitable approach right now? We also have about 40% of all loan balances are under $10,000. So we'd just love to hear your thoughts about equity and debt cancellation, and then Bridget or Katalina, if you have thoughts on that to pitch into, we'll bring you into the conversation as well.
Sure. So that's a great question, and it's quite relevant right now. I think that the first thing that we all need to recognize, whether we may disagree on the best way to cancel debt, is that student debt is a racial equity issue, and we can cancel student debt in a way that will narrow the racial wealth gap. I would also say that we've come a long way on this issue. I'm speaking as a staffer for a member who introduced a bill last year to cancel all student debt, which we introduced it with a small group of progressive lawmakers at the time, and now the bill that the House is voting on tomorrow on the House floor will include $10,000 worth of cancellation of debt. At the time that we introduced our bill, there was nothing. There was no prospect for that. So I think that this economic crisis right now has really shown the urgency of canceling that small amount of debt, at least to help the people that are struggling the most. But there's a long way to go. And I know that there's even growing momentum around canceling $30,000 worth of debt, which would be an incredible step in the right direction. And so as that support grows, it's really important to build on that and recognize that despite what your specific proposal is, there is a need for that.
Great, thanks, Jessica. Bridget or Katalina, any thoughts on debt cancellation and equity?
I mean, those options sound great. I like anything. Speaking like personally as Bridget, I just yes, obviously, but I know that I've seen some stuff out there about how if it was expansive and covered all student loan debt, that it would actually not be, if the question's premised around equity, that wouldn't actually be the best, most judicious use of resources, that in fact focusing on the most low-income populations and figuring out how to do that and allocate it in a way that you really be addressing the challenges that are being magnified, I think, by the COVID situation for the most low-income communities. Yeah, all of it. I mean, but this is, so I don't hang in the policy realm. I'm a fan, long-time listener, first-time caller. I operate on, our work is really about how institutions actually can outpace policy. So what we do is faster. So we're talking about getting resources, like we immediately raised funds and got them in the hands of students, and specifically the ones who are not covered by CARES. So, I don't usually work through policy, but yes, I would love all of it. More payout, especially for nurses and healthcare workers. I mean, come on.
Yeah. Are you implying that policy can be a slow and frustrating process? Is that what I'm hearing from you right now?
Do you have enough time for me to answer that question? Yeah, no, it's very slow. I think that's, and yet I also used to work, I was the chief of staff for a university system. So I used to actually lobby on behalf of 7 universities, and I understand why it has to be slow, right? Because we've seen some bad policy that goes fast. So I completely understand. I'm not someone who's just points at people's behavior and they are good or bad. It's more, I hang in this space because I find that institutions actually, their appetite to innovate and to serve vulnerable students is actually more aggressive than we can wait for policies to, we don't have to be nudged into implementing change.
Yeah, and that brings to mind, I appreciated Uma's point earlier about how so many things that we thought of as, and to Jessica's point too, so many things that seemed impossible or weren't being talked about a year ago, 6 months ago, are now things that, for better or worse, the CARES Act, went through Congress in a couple of weeks. So when the moment actually pushes us to do things, you see things move forward on a pretty fast timeline. But Katalina, I thought I saw maybe you wanted to pitch in, and I'm hoping that our connectivity holds up.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to say on that. I just wanted to reiterate that these gaps have been there for a while, and just the money, thinking about you're prioritizing where your money goes right now, you just can't spare a lot, especially if it's a loan, and it's going to be there for a while. So I don't know, we have to think of policies that serve in the now, just because we need to address things now, and there's a window of opportunity to push forward certain types of policies, right? And so it's just keeping in mind that people don't have that money to spare right now. And yes, it's helpful that federal loans aren't going to be collecting for, I forgot the amount of time, but they're still going to pick up at some point. And so it's just something to think about.
Yeah, those are great points. And right now, those are paused through September, but there's also, I know in the HEROES Act, a provision to extend that through, I believe it's September of next year. And so Jessica, as you're hearing about these perspectives, I know in our audience we have a lot of education advocates across the country. What advice would you give to them in terms of advocating for the kind of priorities that we've highlighted today in these upcoming rounds of COVID response legislation? Is it home office contacts? Is it social media? What are some good tools to make sure members are hearing their needs and needs like Catalina's?
I think that it's so home office contacts, definitely. And I'll share one quick story that was really effective with my boss's office. We have so many priorities, and a group of students from the local community colleges were able to arrange a roundtable with my boss. They were all from all sorts of different backgrounds. And my boss, Representative Jayapal, was, very moved by that. We remained in contact with the students in the institutions that they go to, and were able to get a lot of really great feedback that we were able to feed into, the HEROES Act. Or at least try to advocate for. So that I think is incredibly important, centering student voices. I think Young Invincibles does a great job of that. We've seen a group like Veterans Education Success has done a really incredible job of advocating, bringing in students to meet with policymakers and share their stories. And I think that we just need to see more of this, more students who, are passionate and have great stories, like Katalina, and are able to really speak to the challenges, not in an abstract way, but in a real way that policymakers can feel the pressure from their constituents.
Yeah, I often say that we do our best to have the right data point to come and meet with the policymaker, but in the end, I try to be mindful that it's more common for them to remember a story than a particular data point. So that's why we're so committed to elevating those stories. But we got a good question that came in, and Antonio, I might turn it back to you, and then Uma would love any thoughts you might add. We had a question about, as institutions look at these kind of stark fiscal realities, many we know will be probably tempted to make maybe some cuts to their departments, and they're worried about the disproportionate effect of those department or faculty cuts being in areas where there's communities of color, students of color are most likely to be enrolled. So we'd love any thoughts on that as a manifestation of white privilege or short-sightedness in terms of the diversity of our student population going forward, and what advice you might give to institutional leaders on that front.
Yeah, for sure. And it definitely would be, it is a manifestation of white privilege when we think about it, right? It's core to that. And I completely understand that I think institutional leaders are going to be facing extreme financial pressures from various directions. And I do very much so worry about what that means for specific departments that historically have served our students from minoritized backgrounds, as well as our student affairs offices who are doing this work as well, right? I think I've seen a couple of thought pieces circulating out there on the interwebs that kind of proclaim that a way to solve our financial issues is to eradicate our student affairs positions. And if our mission as higher education institutions is to really develop the holistic student, then I think we definitely need to think through the ramifications of eliminating services like that. In my own research, it has been shown that students perceive, very much so are aware of financial decisions that are made on an institutional level. And when they see institutions cutting resources that are dedicated toward their social identities, then it has a negative effect on influence on the ways that they see themselves. And so if we as higher education institutions are hoping to develop our students in ways that are productive and that are positive, then we need to very much so consider what these financial decisions are going to mean for those who institutions were never built for, and that we oftentimes don't think center when making decisions.
Thanks. I only have about maybe 5 minutes left, but Uma, maybe just any 30 seconds or so that you might add on to Antonio's comments.
Sure. I just want to echo, I think Antonio already said beautifully what I was, going to also to say, and I'll just add that there's lots of departments, like there's a difference between the amount of funds that a department like biology and the sciences can cut. There's not a lot of fat to cut, is that the saying, in an education department, and we were talking about that as a school. And so hopefully when there's like these kind of everyone has to cut $1 million from their budget, hopefully that doesn't come as like a blanket directive to all programs, and hopefully there can be some consideration of where there are more resources already. And same with student programming. I think Antonio's point is a really good one. The institutional signals that are being sent when certain cuts are made, and students are paying a lot of attention to that. And so that is an opportunity for institutions to really frame a positive, inclusive, healthy campus racial climate during these times, that if they take that opportunity.
Great, thanks. Well, we only have just a couple of minutes, and I've asked all the questions, so I want to end with one little curveball, and I wonder if any of you may have a question that you've been burning to ask to one of our other panelists that you'd like to get out before we close out. So I'll just make space for that if anybody has a question they want to send across the way.
Kyle, I guess that means you've done a great job facilitating.
Great. Well, I'm
and
glad
also with the short amount of time, it seems, yeah.
Yeah. I'll just throw in one more, maybe population we haven't talked about, and maybe get any thoughts on our transfer students and how they may be affected. I know we mentioned school closure earlier. So are there any top line thoughts about advice for transfer students? Bridget?
I mean, I think most people are actually going to be hovering for a year, right? Like we're not really sure what's going to happen. And so I would say in this moment, what I'm hearing from students is that you are going to have to be a much louder advocate than you're comfortable with. Just like we're learning that for distance education in general, people have to be more aggressive and pushing for what you need than frankly ever before. And I know that frankly these the populations we're talking about have always had to be their best advocates, and now it's requiring a volume and a consistent, repetitive, level of advocacy on your own behalf just to navigate complex systems. So I would say that's what I'm hearing. It's unfortunate, but then I'm also having conversations with administrators who are at home with their children and also trying to do a job and then try and change that job, and then also getting a furlough. So I think that right now, communicate as much as you can, and try and get whatever your challenges are that you're running into in any transfer process, be as vocal as possible. And I just also think in general, as much empathy as possible, like a dose of that for everyone, because in this situation, there was really not anyone, like everyone is being affected in different ways it's the interplay of those impacts that are causing more obstacles. I know that, also though, institutions are going to be really struggling for enrollment. So the premium on recruiting a student and the ability to enroll a student is even higher. Institutions are going to be fairly, I don't want to use the word desperate, but something like that in terms of fall term as the numbers don't show up. And so, but I do think at the end of the day, choosing an institution that suits your needs and that is actually going to meet your needs in this moment will be important. And so that's going to be likely a distance education, probably near home.
Well, a great point to end on. So I want to thank you, Bridget, as well as Jessica, Antonio, Uma, and Catalina for sharing your perspectives. I think we can all agree that this hour went by fast, and we could probably spend the rest of the afternoon talking about these issues. But I also want to invite everyone to join us again next week on Thursday at the same time, 1:30 Eastern, for a conversation about visionary leadership and the public mission of higher education at this time and going forward. We'll be joined by Dr. Scott Cowan, who was president of Tulane University during and in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, Dr. Michael Sorrell, president of Paul Quinn College in Dallas, as well as another member of a congressional staff from Representative Pocan's office, David Bagby, and Dr. Zakiya Smith-Ellis, the Secretary of Higher Education for the state of New Jersey. Again, please follow us online. Visit our website at younginvincibles.org. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you all again for joining us. Thank you for perspectives, and we look forward to seeing everyone again next week.
Thanks, Pam. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
That's going to be a fire panel next week.
I know. I'm excited. Bye, everybody.